Hello, welcome to another installment of the 007 Files. I'm your host for today, Bill Koenig. I'm flying solo today. Avi Trujillo and David Lee will be back soon. My guest today is a writer. He has written for television, he has written novels, and he has written nonfiction. And in that latter category, he has interviewed various people associated with the James Bond film series. And I wanted to see if we could get talk to him about it. His name is Lee Goldberg. Lee, would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Lee Goldberg. I'm the genuine article. I interviewed a lot of people involved in the James Bond films starting when I was in college. I made it my mission to interview everybody who'd ever written a James Bond film who was still alive. And I pretty much accomplished that. And I made it my mission to interview all the living Bonds. And I managed to do that as well. It was really an outreach of my fandom. I love the James Bond movies. As you can see behind me, I've got some posters. I have all the James Bond posters. I alternate them in my office. They inspire me. The Spy Who Loved Me poster in the back there, I used to have in my bedroom when I was a kid. I mean, I've had these posters since I was a child, and I listen to the James Bond soundtracks when I'm writing. So Bond has always been part of my fan life, but also my professional life as I moved into writing for television and writing novels. My novels have hit the New York Times bestseller list. They're mostly police procedurals, but I've also written spy novels and heist novels and all kinds of things. But Bond's always in the background. You see references to James Bond in my books, and even references to Richard Maibaum and other people who worked on Bond. My little nods to the franchise.
Well, I'd like to start with Richard Maibaum because you wrote an article that was published in Starlog magazine in 1983. They had a big James Bond issue. They had photos of Sean Connery and Roger Moore on the cover, and there were a number of articles. You wrote a feature about Richard Maibaum, and for the uninitiated, Maibaum worked on 13 of the first 16 Bond movies made by Eon. And I have to tell you, just a personal thing, that article kind of opened my eyes to a lot of things because it was during this period we were starting to get more information beyond press releases, beyond what publicists put out. And I'll ask the first thing that caught my eye, and I just want to get your reaction. You had mentioned that Broccoli and Saltzman, the Bond producers, had actually approached Jack Lord. Maibaum told you this, to reprise the Felix Leiter role for Goldfinger, but he wanted too much money, and they moved on. But tell us, just how did that interview with Maibaum occur? What was behind it?
I was a student at UCLA. I was working on the Daily Bruin, but I was also putting myself through school by writing articles for Starlog, American Film, Los Angeles Times Syndicate. And I was just seeking out people I really admired and people who hadn't gotten a lot of attention. This is before the internet. I couldn't find any interviews with Richard Maibaum. And to me, he was the power behind Bond. Yes, we all knew about Albert Broccoli and Harry Saltzman, but Maibaum wrote every movie. Clearly, he had a gigantic impact on the series. And I was really curious about how that worked. And I don't remember how I found him, but I found him and found that he lived near the UCLA campus. I called him. This, again, before the days of email. I called him, told him who I was, and to my shock, he invited me to his home. I couldn't believe it. So I went to his house, and he was so sweet. His wife was so sweet. They had sandwiches and cookies laid out. And he took me to his study, and he had a wet bar attached to his study that was wallpapered in Thunderball wallpaper. It was great. And we just started chatting about the movies. And he said, this is going to take more than just an hour. Would you be willing to come back? I said, I'll come back as often as you like. It turned out to be, if memory serves, a week long. I went there every day for about a week. And we would talk about one or two movies per session. And he was extraordinarily candid about his displeasure with Roger Moore and the way that the movies were going. And I was shocked that he was being so open with me. I wrote the article. It appeared in multiple parts in the UCLA Daily Bruin, and it won me a Rolling Stone Journalism Award. And he was, by the way, I shared that with him. We became, I'll tell you more about that later, but we became friends after that. Yeah, I shared that award with him, and he was thrilled. But that brought, I can't remember whether it was the Rolling Stone thing and the Bruin article, or whether it was when the article finally appeared in Starlog. But Broccoli was outraged. Everyone was furious with him for what he said, and he wouldn't take any of it back. It was astonishing. He wasn't mad at me. He said he knew what he was doing. So a lot of the things he said about Roger Moore and the lines he liked and didn't like and how he felt about the rewrites of his scripts were, I guess he just was finally willing to vent what had been pent up in him for many, many, many years, because no one had ever come forward and asked him these questions.
Well, I reread the Starlog version within the last year. I still have the issue from 83.
So do I.
Yeah, and I get, it's pretty clear. I just want to bounce this off you. It's like, okay, at the time, he was working for Team Roger, but I got the impression his heart was with Team Sean.
Yeah.
And, he definitely was very candid in that. And I always wondered if that caused him problems.
So what's interesting is they still had him back. I mean, he was still essential to the franchise then. And they didn't shut me out. In later years, I interviewed Michael Wilson several times. I interviewed Roger Moore. I was invited to London for the Living Daylights premiere. I interviewed Timothy Dalton. So it's not like the Eon people held it against me for what happened and seemed to think I was a fair journalist, because they kept inviting me back to do more interviews with John Glenn and everybody else. So I guess they reached some sort of accord with Richard Maibaum. And I'm sure we'll get to this later, but I interviewed Maibaum many times after that with each subsequent movie. And he was always candid. And he was furious that Michael Wilson did a draft of License to Kill during the strike and was very vocal about that. And I know he got some blowback for that too.
Well, let's go into that, because I remember you writing on social media that in 1988, there was a Writers Guild strike that year. Maibaum could not work on the finished script. He had worked on the treatment, as they call it, with Wilson. And I've read that treatment. You tell him what he told you. You guys were on the picket line. You were walking the so WJ great. Picket line.
He gave me a big hug. He was so, like I said, we became friends. And after the interview came out, I told him my own aspirations, and we would just stay in touch. We'd talk on the phone every now and then, or we'd have lunch. And I remember when I got my first TV job, I let him know, and he was so excited for me when I was on Murphy's Law. It was a short-lived series with George Siegel that Michael Gleason, who created Remington Steele, starring Pierce Brosnan, was the showrunner on. And so Maibaum was very, very happy for me. But in 1988, when the writer's strike hit, I had just sold my first TV script to a show called Spencer for Hire, and I don't know if I had told him about that. But when he saw me on the picket line, he was so excited. Oh my God, you're a producer. I said, yes. And he was like, oh God, we're colleagues now. We're comrades in arms. And we walk the picket line together as colleagues, not fan and screenwriter. And it was so meaningful to me. And we walked and he was talking about, I guess it was a natural segue from me becoming a member of the Writers Guild and then being there on strike. And he was saying that he was furious at Michael Wilson for continuing to write on the script, that Michael was not a real writer. A true writer would have laid down his pen, but Michael was not. Michael was a producer. And God, if you could see some of the dialogue he's writing, and I can't fix it. He was very frustrated, but also furious that what Michael was doing was undercutting the Writers Guild, undercutting all his fellow writers, and didn't seem to feel any sense of being part of the writing community, of being a writer, understanding why this was important. He was putting the production first, which I understand. He was a member of the family and he had other obligations, but he was clearly violating all the strike rules by doing that.
Well, just a bit of background about Maibaum. Now, in the late 50s into 1960, he had an executive job at MGM with the television division. And I didn't know that for a long time until my daughter wanted to get all the Thin Man movies, and so I bought her a box set. But it included an episode of the Thin Man TV show that MGM made.
And you got a credit as executive in charge of production.
Yeah, and I, because I'm watching it and I'm seeing the end titles, and there's his name, like, oh. And I also more recently saw, this was on YouTube, it was an unsold Dr. Kildare pilot, and his name was on that too. And again, it's early 1960. But then that strike happened. There was a particularly important strike. I think that's when the Guild got health care and other benefits.
It lasted 6 months. It was a devastating long strike. And scab work like Michael Wilson was doing undercut that effort. And at the time, I didn't think that Richard Maibaum would be willing to go back to the series after what happened. But I guess somehow he patched it up and went back. But then, we talked about Living Daylights and all the permutations of that.
What I was going to say about Maibaum, though, was when that 1960 strike happened, he resigned his MGM position because he's a writer at heart, and that's a conflict. I have to end this and join my fellow writers on the picket line.
That's always a danger when a writer becomes a studio executive. They're torn between, two masters. I know that I worked for a long time for Stephen J. Cannell, and he had a studio with his name at the top.
Yes.
And he was also torn by wanting to be one of the guys in the writer's room, but he also had his name on the building. And it was a conflict for him, too. He wanted to be seen as just one of the guys. And I was friends with him, and I was able to say, Steve, you're never going to be just one of the guys. Your name's on the building. You sign our checks. We can't be as honest with you. Like if you come into a story conference with an idea, we're not going to tell you it's stupid because your name's on the wall.
Let me ask you this. How would you evaluate Maibaum's contribution to the series? I mean, you knew him a lot better than most people.
It was absolutely integral. I mean, the Bond films as we know them were an outgrowth of his perception of how to tell a story, of who the character was. Now, granted, I've forgotten her name. Joanna Harwood? Even he conceded, had a very big impact on the Bond films and didn't get the credit she was due for what she did in, I guess it was From Russia with Love. But or was it Dr. No? I can't remember which one she worked with.
It's both, actually. Her name is on both movies.
But he wrote at least either the first drafts or the final drafts, sort of like the role that, forgive me for forgetting their names, the writing team that's been doing it through the Brosnan era. And into
Purvis and Wade through the Craig era.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter who else comes in. They're always the ones who end up either writing the first draft or the final draft. They're essential to the franchise. And you could argue that Bruce Fierstein really steered the Bond era with Brosnan. But Maibaum's influence extended far beyond after he was doing the films because that was the Bond we all knew. The balance between the brute and the elegant quipster. And to me, we get arguments about who the best Bond is, but in many ways, Pierce Brosnan has embodied it all. He had Sean Connery's edge and Roger Moore's elegance and panache and debonair charm. But the way he was able in his writing to transform Sean Connery from a working class kind of guy into an observer of the wealthy and part of it was just brilliant writing. And Maibaum never got the credit he was due for the astonishing balancing act he did. He was able to write these giant action movies and yet actually have, without the angst of the Craig era, a very complex Bond character before Moore, which is why Maibaum was so frustrated by Roger Moore's approach. I mean, in his mind, Spy Who Loved Me, which was not a film he liked, was pure Roger Moore, probably the best Roger Moore Bond film. It was pure Roger. But for the films that Maibaum did, For Your Eyes Only is the only Moore Bond film that he really liked, that he felt was even remotely Bond. I mean, there are some things like he hated that line in Live and Let Die where Bond says, "No sense going off half-cocked." He says, "My idea of wit is red wine with fish I should have known, not, no sense going off half-cocked." That really bugged him.
both have been gone for a long time, but it would be interesting to see a Maibaum and Tom Mankiewicz debate, because the half-cocked line is definitely Mankiewicz, because Live and Let Die is one of the few movies where there was only one writer all the way through, and so we know it's Mankiewicz.
Yeah.
On that one.
Well, I remember. I don't remember the details. It's been 40 years, but Maibaum had done a draft of Spy Who Loved Me, and it was Ulrich Goldfinger's brother, and there's a big problem with that. I can't remember the details, but he didn't like the stuff that. It was that. Maybe I'm confusing with Diamonds Are Forever. I take it.
Yes,
back.
Diamonds Are Forever had a.
And he didn't like what Tom Mankiewicz came in and did, but he did understand why Broccoli did not like his draft, because it dealt with terrorists and it was too political and at the time. But he thought Tom Mankiewicz had gone too over the top and silly. I think probably Maibaum's pride and joy was On Her Majesty's Secret Service, but his disappointment was that he got Lazenby and not Connery in that role.
Yes. Let's switch gears. You also interviewed Michael G. Wilson, who we've mentioned. What's your impression of him? And, because he is listed as a screenwriter on 5 films, all in the 1980s, usually with Maibaum. What's your analysis of his impact on the series?
It's interesting. I interviewed at one point, I can't remember on which film, but I interviewed the two of them together once. And it was interesting because I keep calling him Maibaum, but I called him Dick, Dick Maibaum.
Sure.
And he was always talking about character and structure. And when I was talking to him, whereas Michael Wilson talked the bigger picture, the stunts, the bad guys, the master plan, the location. So it seemed like maybe Michael Wilson came in and had the big idea, or how to take ideas that had been abandoned in earlier films, like the elephant safari and Octopussy, that had been, I think, planned for Moonraker or something. I can't remember, but
the Man with the Golden Gun.
Yeah, he was able to come up with the bigger ideas, and it was sort of my impression. I can't say this the way it worked. Was Maibaum was able to synthesize those bigger ideas and find the character story, the personal conflict, the human stakes that would make the story work, and bring that extravagance to a level that seemed something we could believe in. And I went way over the top by the time we got to Moonraker. I don't know that Moonraker is something that Maibaum would ever have done to that degree. If you look at what Maibaum wrote, they always had big ideas. I mean, not Blofeld in a hollowed out volcano, but he always, if you look at the Maibaum films compared to the ones that other screenwriters did, they had big ideas, but they also had a very personal core. They had a small movie within the big movie, and he was much more about character. I mean, look at what he did for Living Daylights, and how he managed to give Bond this struggle within that bigger movie, and compare that to License to Kill, where Wilson did not have Maibaum there to hold him in, and it's way over the top. All this truck stuff and everything, which was great visually. It served the spectacle, but not character, and it gave short shrift to Felix Leiter, losing his legs and all that, and turned into like a joke at the end. I mean, yes, Bond was throwing away his License to Kill to get revenge, but I think if Maibaum had done the final drafts on that script, it would have been a tighter, darker, more realistic arc for Bond in that movie than what we got.
Just one quick note on License to Kill. I recorded it off my VHS recorder at the time, the Channel E ! They used to have a show that was just movie trailers, and so this had to be like the first trailer for License to Kill. And in the credits at the very end, it just says screenplay by Michael G. Wilson. But then later, the credit became written by Michael G. Wilson and Richard Maibaum, right, in that order. And also, when they were filming the movie, Variety used to have a chart in each issue. Yeah. It's like movies in production. And, and it would list producer director, screenwriter, and screenwriter was just Michael G. Wilson. And I remember seeing that. I thought, what happened to Richard Maibaum? It's like, this is before the internet. I didn't even realize there was a Writers Guild strike going on.
I think at that time it was called License Revoked, wasn't it? Or
yeah.
But I was fortunate that, not just Maibaum, but I interviewed Tom Mankiewicz, and I talked to Christopher Wood. I obviously didn't talk to Roald Dahl. I talked to Lorenzo Semple Jr., who did Never Say Never Again. I'm trying to think what other writers. I think Paul Dane was dead by that time, and Joanna Harwood.
Actually, Joanna is still with us.
Oh, then never mind. I don't know why I didn't reach out to her then. Maybe I tried.
But Dane died, I think, in 1976. So,
and I think I reached out to Harold Jack Bloom, who's a TV writer at the time, and of course I reached out to I've just forgot his name, John McClory, Jack McClory, whatever his name was, Kevin McClory.
Yeah.
But I also talked to Norman Felton, and who was involved in Man from U.N.C.L.E. and some early versions of Bond. And of course, I interviewed Barry Nelson and George Lazenby, Roger Moore and Timothy Dalton and Pierce Brosnan. So it was an exciting time for me. And also the directors. I talked to Peter Hunt. I talked to John Glenn. I did not talk to Guy Hamilton. He had done Remo Williams. I reached out to him at the time. He didn't want to talk about Bond.
Okay. Well, let me ask you about Mankiewicz. You said you talked to him.
What a wonderful storyteller. I mean, spending time with him was a joy. He was such a funny, nice guy who knew everybody, had worked with everybody, and he loved holding court and telling stories. And he was politic in a way that Richard Maibaum was not. He was very careful when talking about Cubby Broccoli and those guys to be very laudatory, and because I think he always thought maybe they'll bring me back to do another polish or something. He didn't want to burn that bridge. But he had such a wonderful sense of humor, and that really came out. And he talked to me about what a joy Diamonds Are Forever was, because he was such a young writer, and to be brought into that and to have Sean Connery in his corner and really championing him was really special. And then to have the opportunity to do Live and Let Die and Man with the Golden Gun. But the Man with the Golden Gun, I think if I remember right, it was the opposite, where Tom Mankiewicz had written this high noon, darker kind of assassin versus assassin thing, and it was Richard Maibaum who came and lightened it up. So it was sort of the reverse.
Yeah, I have a copy of what was Maibaum's first draft after taking over for Mankiewicz, and it's interesting.
Read Mankiewicz's draft? Because I haven't.
I have not. I know that in his version, it wasn't Nick Nack. It was somebody called Demitas, and I'm not even sure Demitas was a dwarf or not. But it's also interesting. Maibaum drafts tend to be kind of specific about the cars. Mm-hmm. So, like his 1965 Thunderball draft, for example. Bond's not driving the Aston Martin at in the pre-titles. He's driving a Thunderbird.
But to be fair to Maibaum, because we can't go back and talk to him about this. I know, because I'm a TV writer and I've also written films. I'm often told you need to put this car in the script because we're going to that automaker for the vehicles. We need the sponsorship. And they need to see it in the script, or they already had started a sponsorship deal of some kind, and it fell through by the time the movie went forward.
Right. Oh, yeah, exactly. Because so then after the titles, Largo pulls up in a Italian-made car. Yeah. So anyway, they switch things around, and so Bond's driving the Aston Martin DB5 in the pre-titles, and Largo's driving the Thunderbird. Because
all you got to do is look at Casino Royale, the Daniel Craig movie, and see him in the Bahamas driving that pissy little Ford Escort, and they try to make it look like a hot car.
It was a Mondeo. And actually, we had a previous episode of this podcast about that. And the thing was, that's not even a real car. It was a prototype. And I knew some of it, and then a friend of mine filled me on more details. It didn't even have a real dashboard. It was like printed, 2D printed. And it had a tiny engine because like a real Mondeo was like maybe 150 horsepower. This didn't even have that. And, but it's, the sound effect. And so
that's not unusual. There was a TV movie called Knight Rider 2000 with David Hasselhoff where he was driving the new Kit. And the new Trans Am had not been put on the market yet. So they gave him this, like we said, a model of what would eventually be coming out by the time the TV movie came out. And it's not uncommon at all. It happened with Mannix too. Mike Connors was given cars that weren't quite ready to be driving around.
Well, not to go too far afield, but of course, perhaps the most famous example of that was the Adam West Batman show.
Oh yeah, the Futura. Yeah,
the Futura, which was customized by George Barris. A friend of mine, well, you may know him, Robert Short, a longtime film professional.
Man from U.N.C.L.E., super fan.
Yeah, he got a hold of this memo. It was like written from the production manager to the assistant to William Dozier, but there had been some delays. And so this memo was like listing all the things that had gone wrong on the Batmobile, like it's breaking down and stuff. It's, at that point, the prototype, because that's what it was already like 10 years old. And so it didn't run very well. But, you have camera tricks, you have sound effects to make.
Well, you go through a lot of cars on a TV show and a movie, so you need an automotive sponsor. The obvious one, the most obvious one of all, is the Ford Motor Company, all the Quinn Martin shows. Everybody on that show was driving, a Ford Motor Company. And probably the most egregious, terrible example in a Bond film is Live and Let Die, where every freaking car in the world was a Chevrolet Caprice.
Yes.
Bond drives into, with the exception of the bad guy's Eldorado Pimpmobile, every car on the freeway was a Caprice. When he went to the Deep South, the same Caprices. It was so narrow-minded and dumb. They couldn't use other Chevrolets.
Well, I've read Bruce Fairstein's first draft for Tomorrow Never Dies. And like his stage director says, whatever car we get. He didn't even try to specify.
Well, when I was doing Diagnosis Murder, I won't bore you with the big, long story, but we ended up having to give Dick Van Dyke's character, Dr. Sloan, a Saab convertible. I mean, of all the strange car partnerships, Saab. But they're very specific about what cars you can use as a villain car. You have to be very careful. It's an aside, but if a bad guy had to drive a luxury car, Ford let them drive a Thunderbird, but they could not drive a Mark IV. It's so weird. It's back in the 70s.
Well, and just to tie up this
I'm sorry, we got astray.
No, that's fine. But I'll just get back to Maibaum for a second. So in his first draft of The Man with the Golden Gun, it's not an AMC.
Oh, the Matador. What a crap car.
It's a Ford. And the gag was, in Maibaum's draft, J.W. Pepper is hardly in it. It's basically like a cameo. And anyway, the car dealership was a Ford dealership, not an AMC. And the gag was, Bond hops in the car and there's a would-be buyer in the car. And the buyer is doesn't say anything. He's not showing any emotion. That was the gag. And finally, when they, catch up to Scaramanga, the buyer says, "I'll buy the car."
It was also so stupid to have it be who goes to Malaysia or wherever it was on vacation and checks out cars from AMC. It's so freaking dumb.
Well, at one point in my career, I interviewed the former head of AMC. At the time, he was on the University of Michigan's business school faculty, and I was talking to him about Bond stuff because this was when Ford had rejoined the series but had cut this deal to promote all their international brands in Die Another Day. And so I asked him about his experience, and he said, yeah, it was fine. We got our money's worth out of it. I told him what Ford had supposedly paid to get involved with Die Another Day. He said, well, that's too much.
The Mustang got great spotlight in Diamonds Are Forever.
Well, and Goldfinger, too.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like, the movie debut of the Mustang.
That does tell you, though, there are some things that impact a screenplay that have nothing to do with the creativity, with the authorial intent, where you are forced to wedge in product placement or go to a certain location because of pre-existing deals. And that happens all the time in television and film. I deal with it now on a show I'm doing at the moment. You have certain products and you have to deal with the restrictions placed on those products. But you can't really make the show if you don't have a lot of that.
Okay. Real quick, let's talk about some of the actors you interviewed. You've interviewed Lazenby. You've interviewed Roger Moore. You even interviewed Barry Nelson, who did the 1954 TV production, live
Hard
TV.
Sense Jimmy Bond. When I found him, I was the first person to ever interview him about that role. And when he had gone completely under the radar and was delighted to finally be able to talk about being the first James Bond. And how he played it sort of like Bogart. And Felix Leiter was more Bond than him in that, but what a pleasure it was to work with Peter Lorre and some of the things that happened during the live broadcast. And it was great. And I got to George Lazenby because you can't tell from looking at me now, but he and I went to the same gym in Brentwood. And I saw him there and approached him. And I later cast him in Diagnosis Murder and had him, I don't have it up here now, but had him sign my On Her Majesty's Secret Service poster. It's a sad story. Poor judgment, really doomed his career. To see him doing those Emmanuel movies or whatever they were with Sylvia Crystal, just cringe-inducing. But Roger Moore, he was the sweetest man. I know I keep saying that, but just a wonderful person. And I think the first time I interviewed him was up in San Francisco. It was probably an off-color story. It was up in San Francisco on the set of A View to a Kill, and he was shooting at Fisherman's Wharf. And we were stealing bits of time together between shots, and he finally invited me into his trailer for a more extensive interview while he was changing. And so I'm interviewing him, and at one point he's changing, and he's stark naked. He bends over and looking up at Roger Moore's ass crack, and I realized they're just like us. They're really no different, just normal people. It's just, there's nothing glamorous about it. Ass. And, but we were talking, and what astonished me about Roger Moore was that he still remembered the names of the writers who wrote the best and worst Maverick episodes that he had done back in the 50s. He still remembered a script by Marion Hargrove that he liked. I mean, and he remembered the writers from The Saint. And, I was putting myself, I don't know if at that point I wasn't in college anymore, but I was surviving as a journalist. So anytime I did a set visit, I did interviews for a whole bunch of possible articles. So while I was there, I also interviewed him about Maverick. I interviewed him about his days at Warner Brothers. I interviewed him about The Saint. And his knowledge of all the writers who worked on The Saint and Leslie his respect for the lowest crew member was astonishing. And I saw him doing that on the set in San Francisco. He knew every crew member by name. He didn't talk down to anybody. And unlike a lot of actors I've worked with since professionally, he didn't have any of these, I am the superstar and you're below the line, nobody. He treated everybody with courtesy and respect. He signed autographs. He took pictures. He was very sweet to me. And every time I interviewed him after that, he always remembered me. He remembered the article I wrote, was able to talk about it. I don't know how he did it. I just don't know how he did it.
Well, real quick, another aside. On X, formerly Twitter, there's a guy named Rodney Marshall who has a feed I follow.
Yeah, I love his feed.
Yeah, and his father, wrote for the Avengers and other British shows. Yeah. And he said he had one post one time that talked about Roger Moore and Patrick McGoohan, different styles of acting totally, but one thing they had in common, they could read a script once and they're ready to go. They had great memories. And it sounds like your experience kind of reinforces that.
Well, he and my uncle Burl, my uncle Burl Bear wrote the definitive book about the Saint. And Roger Moore became good friends with my uncle, and Roger Moore was always approachable. I mean, I never had a problem reaching out to him for an interview. He always made time for me. He was always sweet. Probably the only other actor I've worked with that degree of kindness, and it's not going to be a surprise, was Dick Van Dyke. I mean, Dick Van Dyke treated everybody on the set with and every guest star, even guest stars he didn't like, he treated with extraordinary kindness as if they were guests in his home. And Roger Moore was truly a gentleman. And you don't see that in stars of his stature at the time. I mean, he was, the Tom Cruise of it. Tom Cruise is probably a bad example, but he was the star of the leading action franchise in the world. and was still a really nice guy, probably because he had crawled up from the bottom through the ranks of TV. George Clooney is another one who's like that. I could tell a story about George Clooney that I witnessed. It was really very, very nice. But he's also like that, an everyman who treats everybody respectfully. And Richard Maibaum was that way. He was an old school screenwriter. Even though he was writing the biggest action franchise in the world, he didn't have that I'm an A-list screenwriter kind of attitude that you see so often today. He was about the work, and he was about treating everybody as an equal on the picket line anyway. And the way he treated me as a college student, that kindness really makes a difference. Maybe makes him more relatable to the viewing audience, and is able to take a character like Bond and make him someone that we can all invest in and want to be. All men want to be James Bond. All women want to sleep with him. I don't know if that's the case now with Daniel Craig and his angst-ridden, tortured version of Bond.
Well, let's close with that then, because, first of all, let me mention this to our listeners. Lee's nonfiction writings about Bond were collected in the James Bond films, 1962 to 1989, interviews with the actors, writers, and producers. I believe it was published in 2022, but it's out there, and it's
I finally collected all my interviews, and obviously they were written in their time, so you can get sort of a sense of the evolution of Bond. And so I think I've interviews with Barbara Carrera in there as well, Lorenzo Semple, Peter Hunt. Most of the people I talked to are in there. I've since noticed there's some interviews that slipped through the cracks that I forgot to include, but the major ones are there.
Well, let me just ask you this, though, about the Craig era, which is outside, your book that collected all these interviews. How do you evaluate them? It's been 4 years since the end of the Craig era. We can start to evaluate it. What's your impression of that era?
Well, Bond had to change. In a world where Jason Bourne set the new standard for what an action movie was and who a character was, Bond would have looked dated without acknowledging the way the world and action movie storytelling had changed. But at the same time, I think they lost track of what makes Bond Bond. Sean Connery was a brute as Bond, but he loved it. You could tell that Bond loved what he was doing. Even though it was ugly, this was a man who enjoyed what he was doing, even when it caused him pain, emotional or otherwise. It was still the job he knew he was meant for. He was a blunt instrument, and he accepted that. Daniel Craig's Bond was just too much into the angst and seemed to have no fun. It wasn't until, I know Spectre was a darker film, but that was the first film that kind of felt more like Bond. And there were some moments in No Time to Die. There's that moment where he beats up that guy with the glass eye.
Yeah.
The eye pops out and dribbles down the steps, and he kind of looks at it, and it's like, all right, that was a Bond moment. And it just wasn't there in so much of the wish fulfillment fantasy side of Bond for viewers was gone. Daniel Craig always looked like he had constipation whenever he had to deliver a Bond quip. He even looked like he disliked having to say the name is Bond, James Bond. So I don't think, that's why I think in many ways Pierce Brosnan was the perfect Bond, because he bridged those Roger Moore and Sean Connery eras perfectly. He was able to pull off the one-liners and the elegance, but also to have the edge, a more modern edge than Sean Connery had. And Timothy Dalton doesn't get the credit he deserves. He gave us that harder edge. He also seemed to grit his teeth and his sphincters doing the Bond lines. But Daniel Craig, I think, in many ways took it too far into the angst. And I was not wild about killing off Bond. I understand why they did it. Bond should have survived. It's not a Bond film if Bond dies. There were moments in No Time to Die and moments in very few in Quantum of Solace where it felt like Bond. But most of the time, it just, to me, didn't have that fantasy element, that elegance, that humor. It was just grit. And it's hard when you do Casino Royale and he's had his testicles smashed with a rope. That's not something you're going to see Roger Moore sit down for, or even Pierce Brosnan. But I understand why. I think I said Spectre earlier. I meant Skyfall. Skyfall was where it really kind of felt like the closest Bond to the older Bonds. And I can see why that film made $1 billion. It satisfied the people who wanted the more Jason Bourne kind of Bond, but it did a little more fan service than the Quantum of Solace and Spectre and the others.
Well, just a personal opinion of mine was Spectre, the movie that followed Skyfall. For like the first hour, it seemed like they were threading the needle between Daniel Craig Bond and classic Bond. And I thought for the most part, it succeeded. And then sometime in the second half, it just fell apart. Once they got to what I call the Spectre call center out in the desert, just something happened. And we know because of all those hacks of Sony by the North Koreans or whoever did it, that last part was driving the filmmakers crazy. They could not crack the nut.
But they're also, when they try to be Bond, to the throwbacks to earlier Bond, sometimes it's cringe-inducing. That car chase through Rome or whatever it was,
the car
Bond
drive, as I call it.
In the car. I mean, that was a Roger Moore moment, and it just did not play. It just didn't. To my mind, it did not work. On the other hand, all the stuff going wrong in the car, the music that just isn't Bond, and all the other stuff with the Dymo labeled action buttons in the car, that to me was a more modern take on a humor that Daniel Craig could pull off.
I guess we should wrap this up, but is there anything you're working on that you're in a position to talk about? Because sometimes we have guests and they can't talk about what they're working on.
Well, yeah, it's not Bond related, but my new novel, Fallen Star, the 6th book in my Eve Ronin crime series, just came out. A TV series version starring Madison Lintz from Bosch is in development. And I have a new novel coming out in May called Murder by Design, sort of my take on, I guess you could say, the Saint meets Columbo meets Monk, a very rich, very attractive detective with special skills and a neurological disorder solves crimes using his brilliance. And that, if it's successful, that'll be the start of a new book series. And then one other plug, I'm currently co-executive producer and writer on a wonderful new lighthearted mystery series called You're Killing Me, starring Brooke Shields. It'll be out in early 2026 on AMC and Acorn. If you like hacks and Elsbeth and Poker Face, you'll love You're Killing Me.
Well, listen, I really want to thank you for joining us today, and especially the perspective you could supply about Richard Maibaum, because again, as you said, and I agree with, he's certainly one of the most important people in the development of the series.
But more than that, action films today owe a huge debt to Richard Maibaum. Like John Meston, who did Gunsmoke.
Yes.
Richard Maibaum is a hugely influential writer who has not gotten the recognition he deserves for the monumental impact he's made in the way we tell stories today. It's very sad. I mean, he deserved an honorary Oscar. Everyone talks about Albert Broccoli and Harry Saltzman and what they did for Bond. I don't think there's anybody more important than Richard Maibaum in shaping the Bond franchise and the Bond character, even as we know Bond today.
Well, I was about to say, from a writing standpoint, as I said earlier, 13 of the first 16. The number 2 writing goes to the team of Neil Purvis and Robert Wade. They're at 7, and their time at Bond is clearly done. So, that's, who knows if anyone will ever approach the Maibaum record when it comes to Bond movies. So, anyway, that was something I would hope this episode makes clear. So
somebody, if it hasn't been done already, has to write a book on all the famous writers who wrote drafts that were never shot. Like George MacDonald Fraser and all these others that
Len
went
Dayton.
by the wayside.
Len Dayton on From Russia with Love.
I've got the Len Dayton script. It's awful. It's awful.
Okay.
It's really terrible.
Interesting. Okay. Well, listen, thanks again, Lee, for your time, and thanks to our audience for your time. And this is Bill Koenig at the 007 Files, and we will be back soon. Take care.